G'day, Ian here. Welcome back to another episode of Look Out for Lookouts. This segment will be talking about the development of the Forestry Department and ultimately the plantations and, of course, the fire towers that I've been filming over the past 12 months. But what I'm actually doing is I'm standing in front of a bunya pine. This one is about 25 years old, and I met the gentleman a couple of years ago that actually planted this tree. So this is his legacy. Unfortunately, he's since passed away. But a couple of things about the bunya pine. When you're hanging around it, be careful when you pick up the fronds. They are prickly suckers, and they are very, very sharp. And for a young child, it could do some serious damage. And also, when the bunya pine has got its nuts on, you have to be aware of the ones above you. They can grow up to about 5 kilograms, as you can see from this illustration here. Now, if one of those lands on your noodle, you're off to la-la land. So please be cautious around the bunya pine. It's the companion tree to the hoop pine that I introduced you to up in Toowoomba when I did the last video. So let's now start. Well, we know that the Forestry Department was established in 1900, and that took about 40-odd years of hard pushing and people who were interested in getting some regulations with regard to the timber industry and its future in place for future generations. And the government came to the party in 1900 and established the Queensland Forestry Department under the Lands Department. Now, at that particular time, legislation was limited as to what the future held, who was going to cut trees, what licenses could be issued, where would they be cutting the trees from, native forest, or even, as was considered way back in the 1870s, plantation timbers. Now, in 1910, it was considered about developing a plantation timbers industry by importing certain exotic pines to match those of the hoop and the bunya pine behind me here. Now, that sort of went through the cogs of government for a while, and that was in 1910. Now, in 1917, the first plantings of the hoop pine were at Brolo State Forest near Imbil, to test the hoop pine against other types of native trees to see which would grow the best in a plantation situation. Of course, the hoop pine and the bunya pine came out the winners. Now, 1920, 1921, small plots were planted at the Mary Valley, Atherton, and on Fraser Island to establish the nurseries and the plantations to see what could develop from there. In the 1920s, it was now thinking about really what they thought of in 1910 about introducing exotic pines. Now, as I introduce these, I'll put them on the bottom of the screen, along with their location, where they came from, and their scientific name. So here's some of the ones that were introduced into Australia in the 20s and the 30s to develop the plantation program. First of all, there was the slash pine from the southeast of the United States. There was the loblolly pine. Then there was the Caribbean pine, mainly two varieties, the Cuban and Honduras. Then there was the Monterey pine, which South Australia had already introduced to their plantations way back in the late 1870s. Then we have the Mexican pine, we have the Bishop pine, then we have the Biget pine, and then finally we have the Ocote pine. I hope I'm pronouncing some of these ones correctly. But you'll see, by looking through the scrolling, you'll see where I've added where they've been from. So what they decided to do was look at developing the plantation program using the bunya pine and the hoop pine as the basis of crossbreeding programs. Now, the crossbreeding programs started in the 1920s and 30s, along with these exotic pines introduced, And even up until today, HQ Plantations and others are continually looking for improvements with this crossbreeding. Now, the problem with the hoop pine and the bunya pine, although excellent timbers, rot resistant and pest resistant, they are fire susceptible though, was the fact that it took so long for them to reach maturity, up to 60 years, if not longer. So by crossbreeding these with other pines, they were able to develop the best characteristics of a short maturity period, from 60 years down to 28 to 32 years, straighter trees with little or no knotting. And so these were the things that they were looking for. And that program still continues to this day. And HQ Plantations have developed a number of hybrids, which they classify as southern pines, with various numbers after them, indicating which crossbred one they are. Now, of course, once these plantations started going, there was a massive development. So where did they go? Well, first of all, apart from those ones mentioned earlier, they headed into the South Burnett and Toowoomba region. There was the Granite Belt, which has the most southern pine plantation in Queensland. There was the Sunshine Coast and the Hinterland area, the Fraser Coast, the Gympie region, Bundaberg region, Rockhampton, Mackay, Townsville, right up to Cairns, all along the coast and up into the tablelands. So once these plantations really got going, they really now had to look at fire protection and detection. How was that going to work? Well, when they first started looking at fire protection in the forests, I found some amusing ones. There was 1950, they introduced the local rules for smoking on the job. In other words, when the foresters and workers were in there, they had specific rules as so they don't end up burning the whole place to the ground. They also developed a fire observers logbook around about 1959, which was still in use right up until the late 60s for those in the fire towers. And then they also had fire patrolmen's report forms. In other words, during those high fire danger areas, individuals, workers from the forestry, would be patrolling the forest and making a report on their observations. And that, again, was from those late 60s into the early 60s and 70s. Now, another thing that started to increase dramatically was fire research. But I'll tell you what, there's one more little one I'd like to mention, which I found amusing. The smoking on the job. I found some correspondence from 1959 where one of the workers complained about how long it took other workers to make a durry. In other words, a rollie, a cigarette. And of course, while they're doing that, the others are still working. And he was complaining that they were having too many durry breaks because the others would continue working. Now, I don't know if any of you ever seen anybody roll a durry. Now, of course, the first thing you would have is your tobacco, which normally, from what my experience as being on a sugarcane farm, was obviously log cabin. I've got a picture of one here. And of course, tally-ho papers were a companion to your log cabin tobacco. Then you had your box of matches. Now, in the early days, some of those were wax-proof and you could strike them on anything, but most of the matchboxes came with a rough background so you could strike the match, similar to redhead matches today, but on a metal container. Now, the funny thing is that if you've ever seen anybody try and roll a durry, it can be frustrating. First of all, they get their tobacco out and they take the lid off the tin. Then they got their tally-ho paper and they put that in their hand, and then they get the tobacco and then they put that in like a little narrow strip along the middle of the paper. Then they would start to roll it up tightly and then give it a good lick to hold it all together. And finally, hold it in their hand and then light it with their match because cigarette lighters weren't invented at that particular time. But the funny thing is I've never really seen a good durry made. most of them end up look like a stick from one of the hoop pines or other spotted gums or something they were working with at the time. But anyway, I thought that was the rules were actually written down in the 1950s as to what should be done. And of course, the other one was about billy tea. Everybody cooked or boiled a billy at work, whether that be in the cane paddock, the wheat fields, or that'd be in the forest. So the forestry department came up with a specific set of guidelines and actually a drawing on how a fire drum was to be constructed. And I've managed to take a photograph of the original document, and here it is just here. And it shows you exactly how that drum was to be built. So they did take their fire prevention seriously. Now, of course, as time went on, the fire research increased, as like I said previously. Development of new firefighting equipment and vehicles were purchased. And, of course, the development of surveillance equipment that would eventually do away with our lookouts standing in those towers for days on end during the high fire season. So that now brings us to our towers. What sorts were there? Well, some of them, if you've seen the old photographs, was a tree with a platform on the top of it and some buttons up the tree. You climbed them up there, particularly if you didn't like heights, it could be a bit shaky. Stood there with a pair of binoculars and kept your eye out, or if it was going to be for an extended period, you probably could sit down. So that was one of the first lookouts that was built. Eventually, they developed fire huts. Now, these were normally located on rocky outcrops or high hills that had a good view of the surrounding district and the forest that was going to be watched. And, of course, eventually, as the plantations started to sprout up all over the place, they started to build proper towers. So those towers, some of them were actually made of galvanized steel, and they were based on the Southern Cross windmill design. And the wooden ones who had that design were actually made from local iron bark. Now, in the 1930s, they started to develop cabins. And these cabins were sitting on 4 sticks. And I'll put a photograph of one of them here to show you how awkward it looked. It looked like it was going to fall over at any minute. But anyway, they stood there for decades before they were finally pulled down for safety. Now, of those fire cabins, I've been able to locate approximately 13. There's probably more, but I haven't been able to locate those yet. But now let's talk about our fire towers themselves. I'm going to quote some of the notable ones, not all of them, because over the period of time, there was around about 130 towers and cabins and lookouts built over a 100-year period. So the first one I'm going to mention is the Woodgate Fire Tower number 1 at the Borum Coast National Park. Now, that was built in 1953 to a height of 22 metres, and that wooden tower was actually based on the Southern Cross windmill design. In 1967, at Mount Binga State Forest, north of Toowoomba, the very first 3-legged fire tower, developed by Arthur Lease and his team, to a height of 31.8 metres. I've already done a video on that tower, and it's still standing. And then 1964, the Wajee Fire Tower from the Barracuda State Forest reached a height of 30.8 metres. That was the Wajee Fire Tower number 4. And it was the first of the major 4-legged fire towers that were going to be in excess of 30 metres tall. Now, in 1966, we have the Yulba Fire Tower number 1 at the Yulba State Forest to 36.5 metres, and it was the tallest of all the 4-legged fire towers that were built. However, at this time, in about 1967, a bit of an issue came up, and that issue was the costs of building these 4-legged fire towers. The department wanted to have something cheaper, and of course, the genius of Arthur Lease and his team was building them with 3-leggeds. Hence, in 1967, that's why the first 3-legged fire tower was built, and it was about 1/3 or 2/3 of the overall cost of building a 4-legged fire tower. So it turned out to be cheaper. And so that started the legacy of Arthur Leese and his 12 three-legged fire towers for the next 20-odd years. Now, in 1977, the tallest of the three-legged fire towers was built at Jimna at 44 metres. And it was Arthur's pride and joy. And hopefully, when they redevelop that Jimna fire tower with the museum and whatever else they're going to build there, that'll be his legacy for the fire towers. Now, in 1987, the last of the three-legged fire towers at Mount Wolvie, southwest of Gympie, was built to a height of 21.6 metres. Shortly thereafter, in about 1992, Arthur retired. And that was the last of the three-legged fire towers. And of course, the fancy, we've got to mention the fanciest fire tower or lookout that I've come across. And of course, that one was built in 1992 at Wild Horse Mountain. It's the fanciest fire tower that I've actually come across. So, folks, thanks very much for your attention. That now brings us into our second series of videos on fire towers, and we're looking forward to bringing that to you. So in the meantime, until my next video, take care out there, be safe, and thanks for your company. And we'll catch you next time.